have someone that I think you need to hear speak. And so that's what I did. I heard Shamil speak at a Zoom meeting this summer. And during the meeting, his passion, honesty, dedication to his work was evident and admirable. I knew he'd be a welcome voice and face for New Canaan Cares. A little bit about New Canaan Cares. We're an independent nonprofit community organization whose purpose is to advance the health and well-being of youth and families. CARES provides responsive educational programs that support and strengthen parenting skills, positive youth development, and healthy lifestyles. The vision of CARES is to empower youth, strengthen families, and build community. With this in mind, we feel it is imperative to have this discussion with Shamil as it truly impacts the entire family, our community, and beyond. It is crucial that we as individuals are equipped with the tools to work together in our community in a meaningful, respectful, and peaceful way. With education comes empowerment. Empowerment builds strength, and strength can create change in our community and beyond. To help educate us tonight regarding social injustice in our world today and how we move towards a peaceful solution, we are honored to welcome Shamil Idriss. Shamil is a New Canaan High School alum and grew up in New Canaan and went to Center School, for those of you who know that school that used to be across from the library that now is a farmer's market. He played a role in establishing and then serving on the steering committee of the World Economic Forum Council of 100 Leaders. In 2005, he was appointed by UN Secretary General Annan as the Deputy Director of the UN Alliance of Civilization, an initiative to improve relations between Western and Muslim majority communities. His pioneering efforts in the use of interactive technology led to the establishment of the virtual exchange that President Obama announced in 2015, and later to the European Union's establishment of the virtual exchange in 2018. Currently, he serves as the CEO of the world's largest peace-building organization, Search for Common Ground, whose work was recognized with a nomination for the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. Shamil and his wife, Dr. Cynthia Miller Idriss, live in Washington, D.C., where they are raising their 2 daughters. Welcome, Shamil.
Great, thank you very much, Judy and Stacy, and thank you everybody for taking the time for this conversation on an evening, no less. I really appreciate it. So I was excited for this opportunity for 2 reasons, one of which Stacy already alluded to, which is I'm from New Canaan, and the opportunity to re-engage with my home community is really fun for me, and I've had more of those opportunities in the last year than I did in the previous 20, I think, so that's fun, and great to be reconnected. The second reason is I'm very much on a learning journey on 2 fronts that this conversation sort of brings together. One is, you know, that Nobel nomination was for my organization, not for me personally. So I have the privilege of leading an organization that is full of nearly 1,000 people working full time, some in very challenging and violent circumstances to build peace. And so, you know, one part of my learning journey is very much observing how it is that people can overcome violence and injustice to build safer, healthier, more just communities. And I'd like to share some of the insights from what I've learned from my colleagues tonight. The second learning journey is really around what's happening in this country, specifically as it relates to movements around racial justice. And I have views on this that are evolving. And so what I want to do tonight on that front is just share with you my perspective. But given the fact that it's truly a learning journey, and the first word in tonight's session is learning, for me, I learn best when people speak openly and honestly when we disagree. I learn a lot more from people I disagree with than people who just agree with me. So I really want to encourage people, especially on these subjects, which can sometimes be sensitive for folks, to feel comfortable, not just asking questions, but also challenging, disagreeing, you know, some of my views on this. And I also want to open it up for discussion as quickly as possible. So jumping right in, I'd like to maybe start with a quick poll, and I think I can do this. And if you all are on your computers, hopefully this will work. I'm going to launch the polling. And the question is, what do you think must come first? Peace, justice, or neither? They have to come at the same time. Are people able to? Yeah, I see people trying to fill it out. Great. So we got, you know, 5, 6, 7 saying justice, 2 saying neither, and 1 saying peace. If you're not comfortable answering questions, feel free to defer, but I'd like to just check in if I could. Now we've got two people saying peace. One of the people who said peace, please, could you unmute and just give me a sentence or two about why you said that?
Sorry, trying to unmute. Peace, you have to be able to listen to each other.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. We have 8 people who said justice. It got by far the most. So can somebody maybe unmute and at least share why you said justice?
Peace derives from justice rather than the other way around.
I'm pretty sure that wasn't Amy Wilkinson's voice, but thank you very much for that.
That was my husband.
No, I'm just giving you a hard time. So great. So peace derives from justice. You have to achieve justice before you can. And we had 2 people who said neither. As many people said neither as who said, you know, peace must come first. One of the people who said neither, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, we don't have to. I'm ending the poll. Well, I think it's neither, so I'll speak to that perspective. But let me just share with you a little bit. I mean, it's very
I'm sorry, I was having trouble with my microphone.
Please, Vivian, go ahead.
So I said neither because I think you can still have justice if you kind of what it started doing with the march and doing peaceful protest and speaking your mind. So I think in my ideal world, you would be able to do both.
In your ideal world, okay, great. Well, thank you. Well, any of these answers is pretty understandable. The notion that if you want peace, you have to work for justice, what Mr. Wilkinson was sharing, you know, was very much reflected in Martin Luther King's frustration with white liberals. He talked about when that frustration boiled over, he said, we don't need allies who are more devoted to order than to justice. And his very well-known quote that, you know, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. And so that's really clearly reflected there. But the other perspective that Sarah was sharing around, you know, peace has to come first, you have to listen to people, is very much reflected in Gandhi's, you know, perspective that you have to be the change you want to see in the world. That you can't create a world of mutual respect and dignity through a movement that disrespects, let alone harms, you know, those who are opposing you. And even when you're confronted violently, you know, you don't respond in kind. And I think ultimately, I think, you know, King was very much he was more inspired by Gandhi than anyone else. And I think they both were actually saying the same thing. And the reason that I believe that they both have to come at the same time, and in fact, you really cannot advance one without the other, I think is reflected in the movements that they each tried to lead. They both embraced nonviolence, but they were also incredibly disruptive. In fact, explicitly provocative. Martin Luther King chose Selma as the place to make the stand for equal voting rights because he wanted to provoke the sheriff there, who everyone knew, Sheriff Jim Clark, was likely to respond with violence. And he made sure the television cameras were there so that people's conscience could be shocked. Just like Gandhi provoked the British purposely in a disruptive way, not violently, but by telling them what he was going to do, knowing they were going to set up ramparts and guards to stop him, and then doing it anyway, the Salt March and everything else. And I think my perspective is that, and what I've learned from the people I work with around the world, is that they can be really extraordinary at advancing both justice and peace at the same time, but without misunderstanding justice as punishment, you know, or in any way violence, even for wrongdoing, nor misunderstanding peace as passivity, that peace is just order, even in the face of injustice. So there is an activist element, you know, to this, and the two are really intertwined with one another. So how do you do that? You know, I think it's really important in any society to understand where people are in terms of how they view their situation and their treatment. In my field of peace and conflict, for a long time, people used to look at objective indicators for how stable a society was. Like they would look at GDP per capita, you know, economic productivity, and say, oh, well, this rich country seems to be doing well. This one is tanking economically. This latter one is likely to become more violent. But in recent years, what's proved to be a much more reliable predictor of violence or disruption is the Gallup Happiness Index, which is a much softer sounding index. It asks very subjective questions. Do you feel welcome in your community? Do you feel respected by members of your neighborhood? Do you think the government cares about your well-being? Even if it's ineffective, do you think they care? Are they trying? Are you hopeful about your future, about your kids' future? And what they found is even when people were in dire economic situations, but they were hopeful, or they felt people cared, or that they were respected, those societies stuck together and there was much less likelihood of disruption. And even some societies that were doing economically quite well in the aggregate, where people really didn't feel this way, they were much more likely to experience violence or disruption. And so I would say whenever you're in a community where one group, whether a racial group or a socioeconomic group or a religious group or any community, is consistently feeling very different on that happiness index about whether society cares about them, whether the government treats them the same as everyone else, whether they have any say in their future, their children's future, they have any influence on the things that affect them. You have work to do. We have work to do as a society. So how do you do that work? I'll share briefly how I believe you don't do that work. You don't do it through debating facts. In fact, it's interesting, in today's world, it's important, I think, to acknowledge that truth actually does matter, that there are facts, not everything is subjective, and it's important to recognize that. But it's astonishing how ineffective sharing facts or data are in convincing anyone of anything. In fact, just the opposite, if you share the same statistic or data point with two different people who believe polar opposite things about the world, they will use that very same fact to reinforce what they already believe. And I've seen this in my wife's research. She was doing research in Germany on how teachers were trying to elevate students' consciousness about the rise of neo-Nazism and violent anti-immigrant sentiments and all this. And so she would see these teachers who were from an older generation, a generation that had gone through World War II, or where it was very recent in their memories. And these teachers would be saying, look, immigrants to Germany are playing a more and more important role in providing the social safety net. Look, 20% of the social safety net that takes care of all of us is provided by immigrants. And my wife took she'd observe these classes, and then afterwards she would interview the kids from this one-on-one. And she would talk to the children of immigrants and the ones that were sympathetic towards them. And those kids got very much the message that the professor or the teacher was trying to convey. And then she would talk to the kids who were in and out of the radical right scene, or those who were quite engaged in the radical violent right scene. And they would take the very same facts and they would say, look, this just proves that immigrants one day are going to overrun the whole country. They're becoming a bigger and bigger part. One day we're going to be on reservations like the Native Americans. That was actually an example that was used. And it was the same data point. And this we see time and time again. So one way that you don't advance peace and justice is through the debating of facts. Doesn't mean that facts aren't important. So what can you do? From what I've seen our teams doing around the world now for nearly 40 years is to build trust across those dividing lines. And the way that trust is built across any dividing lines is through not just dialogue, it has to include dialogue, but concrete cooperation. Dialogue is necessary but insufficient. You have to get people doing something together. And what they do together is almost irrelevant. It's got to be something that they both care about or they're both interested in. We have used everything from soccer tournaments to community theater performances to public art exhibits to get divided communities together. Warring ethnic groups, police and youth groups who are fighting in the streets, whatever it might be, because it's a way to initiate the building of relationships. And what we've seen time and again is that the only way to build trust over time is to establish relationships. And the best way to establish relationships is through dialogue that then leads to some kind of cooperation. And in this way, you advance peace and justice at the same time, because you're advancing harmony and intercommunal relations, but you're also getting people to do something together. And over time, when you've built enough trust, they can start doing things on some of the really core sticking points, the difficult issues. I've talked to groups in New Canaan in the past about our work that started with soccer tournaments and within 6-7 years led to an entirely new community policing policy being rolled out citywide in a city like Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. Or work that we're doing today in Congo, which used to be known as the rape capital of the world, where more than 50% of the rapes were being committed by uniformed soldiers or police officers, where after almost 10 years of starting with community theater performances that brought citizens and the police and the military together, and then led to broader advocacy, Eventually, we were able to flip this dynamic. Now, 85% of the Congolese citizens in the areas where we work see police as protectors, and the rates of sexual assault have gone way down, have plummeted. But you have to start by building that trust through dialogue and cooperation. So turning to this country, I'm going to do a quick exercise. We don't have time to debrief it all, but I'd love everyone, if you've got a piece of paper and a pencil, or or you can just do it in your head if you want. Start listing the 5 people in the world who you trust the most, and don't include family members. Okay, so outside of your family, who are 5 people who you really trust? And you could write them down on a list, just top to bottom. Now, across the top of the list, I want you to write a couple categories, just demographics. So gender, religion, age, sexual orientation, race. And just take a quick look down your list and see where they fall on some of those demographics. When I did this, I did it with 10 people. I was first of all embarrassed how long it took me to think of 10 people I really trusted. And then when I came up with the 10, one of the things that jumped out to me was how big a factor religion actually was. I'm not particularly religious. I'm very much believing, but I wouldn't say I'm devout. I'm a Muslim, but I'm not practicing as much as I feel I should. But I found that a lot of the people who I really trusted are quite faithful and devout in their faith, and not necessarily just Muslims, just people who are quite religious. And I thought, wow, I really have a lot of trust for people of faith, I found. I also was struck by certain categories that were empty. I didn't list many young people at all. So this is not in any way meant to embarrass anyone. This is just life. If anyone wants to just share quickly one thing that strikes you from your list, if you're comfortable sharing, we'll give 1 or 2 people a chance to share.
Four of the 5 for Bruce and I were men.
Mm-hmm.
I had an impossible time not thinking of family members, so I had to keep saying, "Oh, family." and then after that, it ended up being all female peers, which is strange.
So look, sorry, Kristen, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, people I've known for a long time, college friends, especially outside of the family realm.
Ironically, I had some professionals, my doctor, my lawyer, and Dr. Fauci. In addition, forgive me if I'm being politically incorrect, but anyway, in addition to longtime friends, female friends, who I have immense trust in.
Mike Duggan.
Yeah. So, this is just, you can do this exercise. A longer list is helpful. It can be more telling. People can do this at work. They can do this at their house of worship. They can do it with their own family. The only reason I raise it is because, if dialogue and cooperation are the pathways to building trust, and that trust is really the pathway towards building more peaceful, just societies, then it can be helpful to seek that with some of those very groups that currently you don't have that trust with. A lot of people don't have trust with folks that they don't really come into contact with anymore. But a lot of people, we all make decisions also about, who we trust and why we trust them. I think the main thing that I want to reflect here is to recognize that to build trust across new lines, you have to work at it. And that's all to bring you back to the last thing I wanted to share, which is my own personal reflections, just my personal reflections about the learning journey that I've been on when it relates to race in this country, and what I'm trying to do about it. And then we can open it up, and I'm happy to, discuss anything people want to. I've come to the conclusion that it is impossible to grow up in this country and not internalize the perspective that whites are superior to blacks. I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I've come to the conclusion that it is impossible to grow up in the country and not internalize that perspective. It doesn't mean that we are all bigots, or nor that the US is not a great country. It's just a reflection to me on how systems work. And then when you grow up in a culture that preferences one group over another, it affects everyone. And for me, I've sort of come to this conclusion through some learning moments. I won't share all of them with you, but just some of them. I remember after September 11th, on the day of September 11th, I was here in Washington, D.C., September 11th, 2001. And my fiance at the time, now my wife, and I went walking in D.C. And there were military trucks going. I mean, this is DC, so there were literally like military trucks around, and we walked through DuPont Circle, the main area where my office was at the time. We passed two black men, and I overheard one of them saying to the other, looking at all the almost entirely white people walking around, he said, they're all concerned about their Pentagon. And I remember that struck me. So he said their Pentagon. I was like, that was kind of odd. And my wife and I kind of talked about later, like, you know, do you feel that kind of outside of society that it's not your Pentagon, it's their Pentagon? I had the privilege when I was working at the UN. Stacy mentioned my UN work. I had the privilege to work with Archbishop Tutu, and I hounded the poor man every chance I got because I was so excited to get to work with him, and so I would have meals with him whenever I could. And he shared with me a few things. At one point, he talked about that it's hard to understand the perspective of truly marginalized people in the very daily, every moment of every day way in which it affects you. He said, when you grow up in South Africa and you're taught that David Livingstone discovered Victoria Falls, but your people were there for decades, centuries, you know, before him. He talked about. I think the most powerful thing he shared with me was he acknowledged that he once got on a plane. The first time he got on a plane and there was a black pilot, and he said the plane hit some severe turbulence. And he said the reflexive thought that hit his mind at that moment was, I hope the pilot can manage this because of his race. He said the reason he thought about it was because it was a black pilot, you know, and that really struck me. And in fact, I cried later, not in front of him, I teared up in front of him, but I cried later thinking about this, that when you grow up in a society that so regularly preferences one group over another, everybody internalizes it, including the members of that group. And it's not something that is easily escaped. It's like swimming in the water. You all are swimming in the same water. I remember when the police cams in this country started seeing the police cams and the imagery of people who were being brutalized by police, I was inspired to read the report, the Department of Justice's report on the Ferguson Police Department. It's not something everybody wants to curl up with and read, but you read that report and it is stunning how intentional, purposeful, planned was the outright, you know, racist policing that was underway. They would set aside a certain amount of the budget for the coming year that they would get through civil forfeitures of from the Black community. You know, people's goods that would be seized, money that would be seized for suspecting wrongdoing, not for any proof. And you know, more recently, this debate around the monuments. I remember when I was at New Canaan High School, and I remember visiting Washington and Lee. It was one of the colleges I visited in Virginia. I didn't think for a minute about why we have colleges named after the leader of a traitorous revolt. It was Washington and Lee. And I remember, even in New Canaan, with excellent education system that we had there, I remember learning about General Lee as being particularly honorable. That stuck with me, that even his opponents thought of him as a particularly honorable man. That was the thing, like that I remember reading about General Lee. So I am worried about the division in this country. I'm worried about the violence in this country. I'm worried about the fact that if you look over the last 40 years, the percentage of both Republicans and Democrats who view one another's party as, quote unquote, a threat to the nation's well-being. This is a poll that's been taken regularly by I don't know if it's Carnegie or Pew, has gone up to more than 40% of each party. A threat to the nation's well-being. We're not talking about I disagree. We're talking about a threat to the nation's well-being. That's deeply worrying to me. But at the same time, I'm more aware than at least I've ever been of the injustice that's persistent in the country. And I don't think we can advance harmony without tackling, you know, some of that injustice. So things that I've been educating myself around, the redlining of districts where Blacks were not allowed to get property. I found out that the housing deeds right here in the neighborhood where I live in Washington, D.C., Northwest Washington, D.C., some of the houses still have covenants in their deeds. They can't be enforced anymore, but they've been stuck there for decades, literally saying this property cannot be sold to a Black, a Jew, or an Oriental. That's a covenant in some of the houses right in my neighborhood. Even though it's not enforced anymore, can you imagine buying that house as a member of any of those communities and reading that in your housing deeds. And so I've become more and more aware of these things. It doesn't make me feel guilty or powerless. It does make me feel, I will feel guilty if I don't do anything about it. So the last thing I'll share with you is just what I've been doing, and then I'm very happy to open it up with my kids, my two daughters. It's really not enough, in my view, for white parents to teach their kids colorblindness, that we're all just equal, because that leaves them ill-prepared to navigate and understand why is so much poverty concentrated in Black communities. Are they just less successful people, less hardworking people? It leaves them ill-prepared to understand the legacy of the lack of generational wealth and why that came about. In my girls' school, which is racially fairly diverse, it's pretty interesting. It's about a third Latino, a third Black, and a third white. It's the largest middle school by far in DC. I'm engaged with some of the other parents and the principal in developing an anti-racist education initiative that will engage the parents with one another first and foremost. As the principal said, the kids are actually more effective than the parents at navigating a lot of these lines. And the principal, a Black principal, has said, too many of the Black parents think because I'm here, they don't have to worry about it. And too many of the white parents think they're not racist, but the stuff they say to me is incredibly racist, some of them. The third thing I've been doing a lot more is trying to give platforms to minorities, racial minorities in my community. We're growing a President's Leadership Council in my organization. I've been diversifying that and intend to diversify my board. Speaking opportunities, I try to turn over more and more and amplify for other people. The fourth thing I've been trying to do is speak more to white audiences. I don't know if anybody saw the Malcolm X autobiography by Spike Lee, but if you saw the film, at one point Malcolm X is going into Ivy League school. I think it was Princeton. It's a true story. He's going to the school, and a white student runs up to him, and she says, "I love your work. You know, how can I help?" And he looks at her and he stares at her with disgust, and then he walks past her, and she kind of collapses on the stairs, like crying. In his book, if you actually read his autobiography, that's not showed in the movie, but in the book, later in life, he reflects on that incident. And he says, "I wish I could go back and tell her, please speak to your own community, because no matter how often they invite me here, I will never have the automatic trust and open ears that you will. It's a more dangerous place for you to speak. You're more likely to lose friends, your mother, but please start speaking up and take that risk because we need you to." And finally, my organization, which has been working in global peace building for nearly 40 years, is doing more in the States now than we ever have. We've always had some work in the States, but and I won't spend a lot of time on it now because I've used up already 25 minutes of my time. But that's where I'm at, and that's some of the lessons that I've learned from our work around the world. I'm very happy to open it up for any questions, challenges, and I think Judy, you're moderating. Is that right?
I am, but thank you. I wish we were all together because you're getting a huge round of applause right now. That would sound really awkward on Zoom. So thank you for all of that. I want to jump off a little bit of what you said about doing more work here in the States. We've got the election coming up next week, and there are predictions of a huge divide. I even heard it compared to the situation formerly in Ireland. So how do we, after the election, how do we start the healing and move forward when there are going to be forces on either side who feel it's in their best interest not to allow us to heal and move forward?
Well, I think a couple of things. One of the things that's really easy to do is to broad brush entire communities by their most extreme voices, which are always the loudest, right? And the most difficult and scariest part of engaging across difference is the anticipation of it, because you build up all these things about these people, right? So, one of the things that makes today's era both challenging but also really powerful is that everybody now, because of social media platforms, is a broadcaster. We're no longer just recipients. And I think being really conscious of what we're sharing online, looking to reach out to people across those dividing lines, providing a willing ear to people across those divides. The most important, one of the challenging things in the social media era is everyone's a broadcaster, but very few people are actually listening, especially across divide. I think YouTube's motto is even broadcast yourself. It's like, it's perfect for the era. And I think if there are opportunities for you to truly listen with interest, not with a view to convince, but with interest to people who you disagree with you, it can be very powerful. Now, that listening is not just sort of surface level. What we found, and you will find this in any mediation effort, is that there's a big difference between people's positions and what underlies their positions. And if anyone here has been trained in mediation, this is one of the first things that you learn. So whether you're mediating between a family or you're mediating between countries, this is one of the first things that is positions are specifically and purposely identified to be really narrow and mutually exclusive. You're either pro-choice or pro-life. The way they're articulated, there's no overlap. There can't be. The whole point is to distinguish themselves from one another. And in fact, the more anger, hurt, and fear you introduce into a relationship, if there's been fighting, if you've insulted each other, if there's been vengeance or whatever, the more narrow those positions get and the further apart they get. So now you no longer just disagree with somebody, you think they're a threat to the nation's well-being, as I was saying earlier, right? So that's what positions are. Underneath positions are a whole range of values, fears, aspirations that people have. Under every position, for every one of us, we have lots of things motivating that position. Why are you pro-choice? Or, for gun control or for, whatever. And if you can go under the positions and really get to understand why people feel what they do. And the way to do it is to ask that question and be serious about wanting to hear the answer. Why? Why do you feel that way? What experiences have you had? Then you start to uncover a whole wider array of interests, fears, aspirations, values. And almost always when you uncover those, it's they're much bigger circles with some overlap. It's like a Venn diagram. So the positions might be up here like this, but the values, interests, aspirations, and fears under them are much more varied, and there can be a lot, and that provides the basis for connecting. You're worried about the safety of your kids at school, so am I. We have totally different positions on gun control, but we're motivated by the same core concern. Can we talk about other ways that we might be able, that concern could be addressed? It sounds simplistic, but I think it is really important. I would start by trying to reach out across some of these divides and express genuine care and listening, especially if your side wins.
Thank you. The old saying, two ears and one mouth.
It's always the losing side that wants to be heard and respected more. And that needs that.
Thank you. Alyssa, I think I saw your hand up. No? Okay. Kristen, was your hand up or was that just an anomaly as well? Oh, you're clapping. Sorry. Got it. Before I go into one of our other questions we had submitted before, does anyone else have a question? You can just unmute yourself and ask. All right, then I'm going back to one of our other questions. You laid out in one of your TED Talks 3 things that are the beginning of transformation that I think are super valuable and kind of tie into what you were saying about the conversation. Can you just share what those 3 are?
I'm gonna try to remember them.
Okay.
So I think it was, in one of the talks I gave, I talked about, trying to determine who loses if you win, right? On any issue, so on any issue that you care about, if your side wins out, just reflect on, well, whose side, if anyone, loses? And then the second step is to make a decision that you actually care about that person's welfare. And that's not a simple thing. It's important. Unfortunately, in today's polarized states, I think a lot of people are increasingly feeling, you know what, I don't care about those folks over there. In fact, I wish they would just go away. But make a decision and a determination and a commitment that you actually care. And then the third step is to reach out, to try to engage them and build a relationship with them, to understand where they're coming from and why it is they believe what they believe, and how their very human and understandable desires and needs could be met maybe in different ways. Most of the work that happens in peace building is not taking 2 static things and having one win out. Most of the work is engaging people across their dividing lines to build enough trust where they begin to realize and even co-create a whole third way where both of their needs can be met. where everyone can live in dignity. And when it comes to these issues of racial justice, I think one of the fallacies that people have is the notion that the reason to work on these issues is to liberate Black people or to alleviate the suffering of Black people. I think that there's part of the equation is that, but I truly honestly believe, and I've been inspired by some of the greats in peace building and justice movements, that on the other side of all this, if we do it, is liberation for everyone. When Gandhi talked about this all the time with the British, that it would be liberating for the British not to be despised and hated as much as they were in India, but welcomed back as partners. James Baldwin talked about in the States, he talked about the white Southerner, and he said they're so tied to thinking that the only thing to be proud about, this was his words, is that racist past, that they're unable to be proud about other things. They would be liberated if they could let go of that history and be proud of other aspects of their culture, of our shared culture. And I think it's very easy for people who are in a more privileged position to have that view, but when you hear it from people who don't, it's incredibly inspiring, and I fully believe that. And I've seen that in our work. I'll end with this, that so often, particularly in the police forces, the security forces that are abusing populations, so often it's not necessarily people driven by hatred. It's that they're stuck in a system where they're not paid that much. There are all kinds of ills in society that generations of political mismanagement have created. And then they're sent in as police to basically keep the lid on in impossible situations. And they're expected to be not just law enforcers, but social counselors and all this stuff that they're not equipped to do, and frankly shouldn't be expected to do. And they react, many of them, sometimes they're not very creative. Sometimes they don't have relationships with the community they're working with. They react top-down control and in a forceful way. It just reinforces this cycle. And for those communities also, it's very liberating when they can build relationships where there's trust between them and the community, where the community respects them and actually calls them proactively to help with issues because they no longer fear them. But getting there requires that work.
Thank you. Love all that. I'm going to tie in a question that Amy put in the chat with one we had submitted previously as well. You had the incredibly unique experience growing up of spending most of your time in New Canaan, but then if I recall correctly, you went to visit your mother's family in Turkey every year. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So you got out of the bubble of New Canaan and learned different perspectives. Not all of our kids have that opportunity. And as Amy says, on college campuses, when kids are learning, often the administration bring in people to speak that back up their current point of view. So what can we do as parents, as people in the community to expose our children and even, you know, our colleagues here in town to other points of view in a way that isn't going to feel as if we're preaching to them?
Yeah, I think I put a lot of stock in youth leadership. Most of the powerful movements in history have been instigated by young people. And so I think there's one aspect which is providing those opportunities and that support for them to engage across difference. And in today's era, there's a lot more ability to do that. We have a lot more access to resources. The fact that we have these digital technologies and social media, it's unfortunate that we tend to use it to subscribe to sources of information that reinforce everything we already believe, rather than use them for the broadening of perspectives that they enable. But there are opportunities to get much more access to interesting information. And I'm sure, I think Stacy was sharing with me, that I know a lot more book clubs have gotten started in New Canaan and elsewhere around issues of race. The videos, the truth about the U.S. Confederacy, that one of the best lectures I've ever seen, that I told my daughters we have to watch together and I want to discuss with them. It's one of the best lectures about American history they've ever seen by an NAACP lawyer. The documentary 13th, which is a tough documentary, but appropriate for teenagers, I think. Discussing their opportunities to reflect. I think the question that I'm seeing about the college campuses is the sort of closing of that space, right, where there are protests. And one of the initiatives that we launched that I'm most excited about is called First Year Connect, which is an effort to reimagine to reinvent how students are oriented on college campuses, specifically by putting them into small roundtable dialogue groups in an online space before they ever arrive, after they've been accepted, but before they arrive on campus, across the racial, political, and other dividing lines, for the specific purpose of building relationships, trust, and discussing and learning how to discuss difficult issues. Issues where they're not necessarily, and frankly, aren't even intended to agree at the end, but they learn to really respect one another's opinions. I think that colleges today are understandably feeling the pressure that they either have to protect free speech or create safe space. This polarized choice has been put before college administrations, where you either create a safe space for everybody or you provide protect free speech. But actually, I think it's a false choice. But the only way to make it a false choice is to support the students themselves to learn from their first interactions on campus how to have difficult conversations, how to even facilitate those conversations. You know, I would love to see in every school system in this country, down to the fifth graders level, peer mediation. It's one of the best things you can do for kids, for them to learn that they can actually step into conflict with confidence and in a constructive way. It teaches them how to distinguish between positions and values and interests. And oftentimes the kids who are most effective as mediators are the very ones who had previously been bullies or been the ones who are instigating things. Oftentimes the kids that will exhibit one kind of leadership exhibit another kind if you just give them that chance. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to expose young people and even provide them with training in mediation, in dialogue facilitation, and enable them to participate in those diverse settings in an online space, or certainly when they go to college. If anyone's interested in First Year Connect, it's the new program. The whole goal of it is to pilot it this year and next year. We just got the results from Amherst College, which is one of the pilot schools. They're having every incoming student go through this orientation, and they love it. I've just got the statistic that 91% of the Black, Indigenous, and students of color love the program and highly, and that's great. So, so there are a lot of things I think that young people can do, but you can also start by exposing them to other perspectives, other books, speeches, and then frankly really listening to their ideas. I think I shared it in past with some people here, but people forget that Gandhi was only 24 years old when he established the Natal Indian Congress to fight discrimination against the Indians in South Africa before he went back to India. And Nelson Mandela was only 25 when he co-founded the youth wing of the African National Congress. And even Martin Luther King was only 26 years old when he launched the Montgomery bus boycott. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is those ages are getting younger, and women are more and more engaged now. We see the youngest Nobel Peace Laureate in history is Malala, the 15-year-old Pakistani. We see Greta Thunberg in Sweden, also 15 years old when she started the protest. And even that monk, I don't know, has anyone ever heard of Claudette Colvin? Claudette Colvin is everyone who's heard of Rosa Parks. Everybody, right? Claudette Colvin inspired Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin was the 15-year-old Black girl who refused to give up her seat on a bus. And it was her case that went to the Supreme Court. And it was actually the resolution of that case which ended segregation, which got King to call off the bus boycott. But nobody remembers Claudette Colvin, this 15-year-old girl. They remember Rosa Parks, the older adult who did the same thing. So anyway, I put a lot of faith in young people to actually take the action. We just have to provide them with some exposure to a broader array of educational opportunities and skill sets to dialogue across difference and to facilitate those dialogues.
Okay. So one of the questions that we hear all the time is what's different this time? You know, we've seen social and racial justice movements in the U.S. throughout the years. What, if anything, is different this time that's going to bring about real change?
I'm curious what people on this call think. I will tell you a couple of things that strike me. I've never seen the diversity and the number and the sustained nature of the protest movement that we're seeing now. This is the largest and most sustained movement for racial justice that this country's ever seen. When we saw police in the early stages on everything from TikTok to Twitter, whatever, like coming out on themselves saying this is unacceptable, this is not good police, behavior, this is not, I had never seen that before. In a study of nonviolent movements, a study that looked at nonviolent movements and their capacity to drive lasting systemic change as compared to violent movements, some of the key factors that there are two women who developed this study who I know well. It's fascinating. They looked at, I think, over 200 movements over the last few hundred years. And they found that being able to sustain movements and diversifying their tactics, that you're not just marching in the streets, but whether it's boycotts or sit-ins or it's economic actions or it's other things, you need a diversity of tactics. Critically, when you start seeing the security forces ally themselves with you or start to splinter, and very important, when the oppression comes, and it almost always comes, there's some pushback, that you remain nonviolent, that you're able to sustain that nonviolence discipline. Those were the sort of key factors that they identified of successful nonviolent movements. Now, I think the jury is still out whether this is going to go in that direction. I do think some of the police budget conversations that have been instigated and in some cities passed as a result of this, I think seeing everyone from Walmart to the NFL actually make stances. I mean, when you got Walmart and the NFL actually supporting your cause, you've made some progress. But I think the jury is very much still out, and we're not there yet. So I'm hopeful that this is a tipping point, as somebody has raised. But I think those things have to hold. And I'm curious other people's views. I see my mother.
Forgive me for intruding, but I have a personal perspective that's very pertinent. I came to the United States when I finished high school in 1963, right in the midst of the civil rights movement and right in the midst of anti-Vietnam sentiment. And I think the protests in that period may have often confused those two factors. Experiencing what we're experiencing today, almost 60 years after those years, I recognize a couple of things. Number one, with regard to civil rights, I was shocked what I knew as America and what I longed for as America, I was shocked to find the racial divide. So that was a new experience for me. What I recall from those years is even a very liberal-minded college classmate, a white woman, at that time had said, well, Blacks want to be in their own communities also. It's not just, a segregation issue. They want to be segregated. So thinking back to that climate and looking at today, the point about there being far more recognition of the deep-rooted systemic racism by the white population, by a very diverse population, I think that's a very, very significant difference today. Obviously, there's a long way to go yet to find the right balance, but from my personal experience, that's what I'm seeing as difference. It distresses me that the same prejudices that I witnessed then exist today, some of it systemically, but what's different is there's a far more diverse population recognizing that racism and wanting just, this evening is evidence. There's a desire to want to do something about it, which is so important.
I will tell you one of the things that's really hard. If you look at post-war situations, and we had a civil war, right? So you look at every post-war situation, in the seemingly the easiest, the least costly anyway, and the easiest reparation is an official apology, right? From the aggressor or the instigator, if there was one, right? And yet it is always, always, always the very last thing to come, if it ever comes, right? It took us until the Reagan era to have an official apology for the Japanese internment camps during World War II. It comes, this is very typical. And I think one of the reasons is because the mythology we tell ourselves about our own identity, as soon as you say, what, we were wrong, in fact, we weren't on the right side of this fight. We were on the wrong side of this fight, and it was unjust. And we not only apologize, but we want to make reparations some way if we can. That process is, even though it isn't necessarily costly in the way that other things are, it shakes people's sense of their own identity and the kind of heroic narrative we oftentimes have about ourselves. And so I think being willing to acknowledge not only the history, but the current legacy of that history and how that racism still manifests to this day in how laws are applied and even in some of the laws themselves, that's being able to do that without necessarily feeling like, well, I'm being blamed for, you know, if we can find a way to sort of acknowledge these things so that we can move past them together, rather than feel that admitting that somehow diminishes what we think of this country. On the contrary, I think that would be really vital, but it can be very difficult for people to do because it shatters their whole self-conception.
Do you think that if we were to have reparations, that it would actually allow interracial understanding to improve? I think
that reconciliation and relationship building as a whole happens at the local level. It happens where people live, where communities are sustained, where they have to work through problems one way or the other. And so my view on what needs to happen in this country is that I would like to see a truth and reconciliation type process that is animated and driven at the local levels of communities. Ideally, it would be amplified and somewhat coordinated at the national level where you'd be seeing but you know what? I'm not going to wait. If we wait for a federal level, there may be a federal level movement for reparations. If there were one, I would support it because I think it's long overdue. But I think if we just jump to that without this work at the local level, I think we're very likely to see more of this sense of, well, this is a win-lose game, and now we're going to lose, you know, in how people read that kind of a process. And in fact, one of the things that it's not half-baked. It's very early in the baking process. You know, we're talking to a very successful television producer, Hollywood television producer. He's produced a ton of the shows that people on this call would know, about whether we could actually televise a truth and reconciliation type process, a traveling process in different communities across this country as a way, and pick the communities where we think it's really ripe for this, as a way to spur and spark something much bigger, you know, that would happen in this country. But Amy, to answer your question, my personal perspective is that reparations are frankly long overdue, but that if they're not undergirded by that relationship building, I'd love to see local communities say, you know what, let's first learn about what actually has happened in this community around these issues. Oh my goodness, even though I live in this very diverse area now, there are covenants that still say Black people can't own a house, even if they're not. It's good to know that. Oh, you know, I'm telling specific true stories. Oh, this building at my girls' middle school, that building, that wing was built for the Black students. That was the segregated building. Oh, that's kind of good to know. You know, the fact that, you know, why is Oregon the least integrated, the whitest state in the country? It was explicitly established as such. It's astonishing how recently, you know, some of the laws in Oregon have changed. I mean, so I would love to see a process where communities can learn about our own history together and then determine together how we want to go forward. Which monuments should we have? Rather than just tear down that monument, don't tear that monument. What are the monuments we'd like to celebrate? What can we all feel proud of that every one of our members of the community would really love to see in the central town square? That's the kind of process that I'd like to see us go through. I'd love to see it happen at the local community level all across the country, with some national coordination and amplification. But in lieu of that, I would frankly take any step towards acknowledgement and reparation.
Well, it seems like, at least around here, it seems that the New Canaan community is taking steps through a 6-part speaker series that just ended last night, actually, where many hundreds of people were listening in and getting educated on a lot of these issues. And I don't know whether that will then lead to some kind of a call to action. I know in Stamford, right after the George Floyd killing, the community came together, hundreds of nonprofits came together, and they established a call to action and asked each of those organizations that signed on to develop their own series of steps that they wanted to take before the end of the year. Whether they will actually take those steps, I don't know. But, you know, it seems like people are doing things as a result of this new awareness that may be beneficial, hopefully will be beneficial.
Yeah, so Amy, thank you for bringing that up about the New Canaan, the series that was led by the coalition here in New Canaan. We are actually part of that conversation. And I will tell you that we are currently in the planning stages for the next phase of that and how to move into an action now that there's been some learning. What do our next steps look like, both as a coalition and individual nonprofits? So you will hopefully be seeing that come out within the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned. And Shamil, I will say that when you are ready for the Truth and Reconciliation Tour, please sign CARES Up to be part of that host here in New Canaan in the area. And we will happily bring together a coalition in Fairfield County, because I think that is, we need to bring together the various communities here in Fairfield County, because we are all in our own little pockets. So, and I want to say thank you for your perspective and this amazing human being that is able to share with us tonight. So to wrap things up, is there any one thing that we want to walk away with this evening? If you could tell us one thing to take out into the community with us, what would it be?
I think the most important starting point, not to sound trite, is hope. And I think a lot of people are losing hope right now, but it's an incredibly hopeful time, actually. Whether you, time and again, we see that too often you have to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough. And we're having a real breakdown. And at that moment of breakdown, you can just say, gosh, it's all hopeless. But it's the stuff that comes out the other end of that where you really get to reinvent your communities and our society as a whole. So I'm actually very hopeful. And I think if you can draw that hope from other people around you who sustain it in you when you get down, I think that's really important. I put a little link in there to the college program that I mentioned that we just launched in case anyone's interested. But thank you all very much, especially on a weekday evening for joining.
No, thank you for joining us. We are sad that it had to be virtual. We hope to have the opportunity to actually host you in person at some point. And thank you everyone for taking your time out to be with us tonight.
Excellent. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.